The black Humvee idled menacingly in the driveway, its hulking frame casting an ominous shadow across the manicured lawn. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white as she stared at the ominous violation notice plastered to her windshield. "Those HOA tyrants think they can push me around," she muttered through gritted teeth, her eyes narrowing with defiance. Snatching the paper, she crumpled it in her fist, a plan already formulating in her mind. Slamming the Humvee into gear, Sarah peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching in protest. She had to act fast before the HOA launched their next attack. As she sped through the pristine streets of the gated community, Sarah's heart raced with a dangerous cocktail of fury and adrenaline. Pulling up to the old military surplus store, she burst through the doors, startling the clerk. "I need the biggest, meanest tank you've got," she demanded, slamming her fist on the counter. "Money's no object." The clerk's eyes widened in bewilderment. "Ma'am, I can't just sell you a—" "Don't give me that crap," Sarah interrupted, slamming her palms on the counter. "I'm the victim here, damn it. Those HOA vultures are trying to ruin my life, and I'm not going to let them get away with it." The clerk held up his hands in a placating gesture. Okay, calm down. Let me see what I can do." Sarah drummed her fingers impatiently as the clerk disappeared into the back, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't let the HOA win. Not this time. They'd pushed her too far, and now it was time for payback. When the clerk returned, he was followed by a pair of burly men wheeling a massive, hulking tank onto the showroom floor. Sarah's eyes gleamed with triumph as she circled the behemoth, running her hand along the cool metal. "Perfect," she murmured, a sleek grin spreading across her face. "How soon can you have it delivered?" The clerk cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, I really can't in good conscience sell you a—" "I don't care what your conscience says," Sarah snapped, cutting him off. "I pay in cash, and I want that tank parked in my driveway by the end of the day. Understand?" The clerk hesitated, but one look at the determined fire in Sarah's eyes told him he had no choice. I'll see what I can do." Sarah nodded, a satisfied smirk on her lips. "Good, and make it fast. I've got a score to settle." With that, she turned on her heel and strode out of the store, her mind already racing with the endless possibilities. The HOA had no idea what was coming. Sarah paced anxiously in her driveway, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the Humvee had once been. Any minute now, the tank would arrive, and then the real fun would begin. Just as the thought crossed her mind, the low rumble of an engine echoed down the street. Her head snapped up, and a triumphant grin spread across her face as the massive tank lumbered into view, its treads grinding against the pristine pavement. "Yes," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. The tank slowly rolled to a stop in front of her house, dwarfing the surrounding vehicles. Sarah approached the hulking machine, running a reverent hand over the cool metal. "Welcome home, beautiful," she murmured, her eyes gleaming with mischief. As the tank's engine rumbled to a stop, the hatch on top swung open, and the driver peered out. "Ma'am, I really must protest this," he called down, his voice laced with concern. "This is highly irregular, and I can't guarantee your safety or the safety of others." Sarah waved a dismissive hand. "Safety. Don't be ridiculous. This is about justice, my friend. Now get that thing parked in my driveway pronto." The driver hesitated, but one glance at the determined expression on Sarah's face told him he had no choice. Slowly, he maneuvered the tank into the driveway, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Once it was in position, Sarah circled the vehicle, her gaze sweeping over every inch of it. She couldn't believe it was really here, ready to do her bidding. Climbing up the side, she heaved herself into the hatch, settling into the commander's seat. "This is it," she murmured, gripping the controls. "Time to show those HOA bastards who's boss." Just then, the sound of a car approaching caught her attention. Peering over the edge of the hatch, She watched as a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway next door. The driver, a well-dressed man in his 50s, stepped out, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What the?" he began, his gaze fixed on the tank. Sarah's lips curled into a wicked grin. "Showtime," she whispered, her finger hovering over the firing mechanism. The man gaped at the tank, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, striding towards Sarah. Sarah leaned out of the hatch, a cruel smile on her lips. "Why, Mr. Walters, I'm simply exercising my right as a homeowner to park whatever I please in my own driveway." She let her finger trail over the firing mechanism, eyes glinting with malice. Walters, the president of the HOA, paled visibly. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "This is a clear violation off." "Violation," Sarah interrupted, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Why, I believe you're the one who's been violating my rights, dear Mr. Walters," she tusked, shaking her head. "And now, you're going to pay the price." Walters took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between Sarah and the imposing tank. "Now, let's not do anything rash," he said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm sure we can discuss this like reasonable adults." Sarah let out a harsh laugh. "Reasonable? You people have never been reasonable." She leaned back in the commander's seat, drumming her fingers on the controls. "No, I think it's time for a little retribution." Walters swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sarah, please, let's talk this through. There's no need for—" But Sarah wasn't listening. With a wicked grin, she gripped the firing mechanism, her finger poised to pull the trigger. "Say goodbye, Mr. Walters." Just then, a commotion erupted down the street as a swarm of patrol cars descended on the scene, their sirens wailing. Walter's face lit up with relief, and he turned to Sarah with a triumphant smile. "Looks like your little stunt is about to come to an end, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with smugness. Sarah's grip on the controls tightened, her knuckles turning white. She'd been so close, and now the police were ruining everything. Gritting her teeth, she reluctantly pulled her finger away from the trigger, glaring daggers at Walters. "This isn't over," she growled, as the police surrounded the tank, their guns drawn. The air was thick with tension as the police officers cautiously approached the tank, their weapons at the ready. Sarah could feel their suspicious gazes burning into her as she slowly emerged from the hatch, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle and put your hands on your head," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. Sarah complied, her movements slow and deliberate. As she stepped down from the tank, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She'd been so close to exacting her revenge, and now it was all crumbling around her. The officers quickly surrounded her, their guns trained on her as they handcuffed her wrists behind her back. Sarah gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to lash out. She knew that any sudden movements could be interpreted as a threat, and she couldn't afford to make the situation any worse. As the officers led her to a waiting police car, Sarah caught a glimpse of Walters standing off to the side, a smug grin plastered on his face. She glared at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and resentment. "This isn't over, Walters," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You and your precious HOA are going to pay for this." Walters simply chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that, Sarah," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Sarah was shoved into the back of the police car, the metal cuffs biting into her wrists. She could feel the anger and frustration bubbling up inside her, threatening to boil over. She knew that she had to keep a level head, but the injustice of the situation was eating away at her. As the car pulled away, Sarah stared out the window, watching as the tank disappeared from view. She couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, knowing that her plan had been so close to succeeding. But she wasn't about to give up that easily. Sarah had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to let the HOA win without a fight. She'd find a way to get out of this mess, and when she did, she was going to make sure that Walters and his cronies paid for what they'd done. Sarah sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table in front of her. She had refused to speak a word since the police had dragged her away from her driveway, her defiant silence only fueling the officer's frustration. The door suddenly swung open, and a stern-faced detective strode in, his brow furrowed in a scowl. He slammed a thick file down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers drumming anxiously on the table as she recounted the events that had led her to this point. It all started a few weeks ago, when I got that stupid violation notice from the HOA, she began, her brow furrowing in frustration. They claimed my car was parked in the wrong spot, even though I've been parking there for years without any issues. She shook her head, her lips twisting into a bitter smile. But you know how those HOA vultures are. They just love to nitpick and find ways to make our lives miserable. The detective nodded, his expression one of understanding. Go on, he prompted, his pen poised over his notepad. Well, I tried to reason with them, to explain that it was just a silly mistake. Sarah's voice dropped to a murmur, her gaze downcast. But they wouldn't hear it. They just kept pushing, threatening fines and even legal action if I didn't comply. She looked up, her eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was being bullied in my own home, and I wasn't going to stand for it. The detective leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in contemplation. I can understand the frustration, Ms. Simmons. Those HOA rules can be a real pain in the ass, and it sounds like they were being pretty unreasonable in your case. Sarah nodded emphatically, her fingers curling into fists. Exactly. That's why I had to do something, you know. I couldn't just sit back and let them walk all over me. She paused, her expression darkening. That's when I came up with the idea of the tank. The detective's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his voice laced with concern. The tank? You mean to tell me that you actually went out and bought a military vehicle, just to park it in your driveway and intimidate the HOA? Sarah nodded, a defiant glint in her eye. Yep. I figured if they were going to play hardball, then I was going to show them just how serious I was about standing up for myself. The detective let out a low whistle, shaking his head. That's a pretty bold move, Ms. Simmons. I've got to hand it to you. You sure know how to make a statement. Sarah allowed herself a small, rueful smile. I just wanted them to know that they couldn't push me around anymore. I was done being the victim. The detective nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand where you're coming from, but you have to realize that what you did was extremely dangerous and illegal. You could have seriously hurt someone. Sarah's shoulders slumped, the weight of her actions finally settling in. I know, she murmured, her voice laced with remorse. I wasn't thinking straight. I was so blinded by my anger that I didn't stop to consider the consequences. The detective let out a heavy sigh. Well, Ms. Simmons, you've certainly landed yourself in a real mess. But I think we might be able to work something out, if you're willing to cooperate. Sarah looked up, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. What do you mean? The detective leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm willing to listen to your side of the story and see if we can find a way to resolve this without too much legal fallout. But you've got to be honest with me, and you've got to be willing to make some concessions. Sarah nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of trepidation and relief. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm listening. The detective leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. All right, Miss Simmons, here's the deal. I'm willing to work with you on this, but you're going to have to make some serious concessions. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for the detective to continue. First and foremost, you're going to have to agree to a plea bargain, the detective said, his tone firm. That means pleading guilty to some of the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah's heart sank, but she knew she didn't have much choice. Okay, what kind of charges are we talking about? Well, we can likely drop the attempted assault charge, since you didn't actually fire the tank's weapons, the detective explained. But you'll still have to plead guilty to illegal possession of a military vehicle and reckless endangerment. Sarah nodded, her jaw set in a determined line. Fine, I'll do it. What else? You'll also have to agree to pay restitution to the HOA for any damages or legal fees they incurred as a result of your little stunt, the detective continued. Sarah's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the detective held up a hand. I know it's not fair, but it's the best we can do to avoid a lengthy and expensive court battle, he said, his expression apologetic. Plus, it'll show the judge that you're taking responsibility for your actions. Sarah let out a frustrated sigh, but she knew the detective was right. Okay, fine. What else? Finally, you'll have to agree to some kind of community service or probation, the detective said. We're talking at least 100 hours of community service, and maybe even some anger management classes. Sarah's shoulders slumped, but she nodded in resignation. All right, I'll do it. Anything to avoid a longer prison sentence. The detective nodded, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Good. I think we can make this work, Miss Simmons. With your cooperation, we might be able to get you a relatively lenient sentence. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she couldn't shake the sense of defeat. She had come so close to getting her revenge, only to have it all come crashing down around her. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, we'll need to get the paperwork started right away, the detective replied. I'll talk to the prosecutor and see if we can get a plea deal finalized as soon as possible. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. All right, let's do it. As the detective rose from his chair and headed for the door, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She had been so close to teaching the HOA a lesson, and now she was the one facing the consequences. But deep down, she knew that the detective was right. She had to take responsibility for her actions, no matter how unfair the situation felt. With a heavy sigh, she steeled herself for the difficult road ahead. As the detective left the room, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts, the weight of her actions bearing down on her. She had come so close to exacting her revenge, only to have it all slip through her fingers. Closing her eyes, she replayed the events of the past few hours in her mind. The rush of adrenaline as she watched the tank rumble into her driveway, the thrill of wielding such power, and the crushing disappointment when the police had swooped in to put an end to her plan. She couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. After all, the HOA had been the ones who had pushed her to this point, with their endless nitpicking and petty rules. Didn't she have a right to fight back, to stand up for herself? But as the detective's words echoed in her mind, Sarah knew that she couldn't justify her actions, no matter how justified they had felt in the moment. She had put innocent lives at risk, all in the name of her own personal vendetta. With a sigh, she opened her eyes and stared at the cuffs binding her wrists to the table. She knew that she had made a mistake that was going to cost her dearly. The plea bargain the detective had offered was her best chance at avoiding a lengthy prison sentence, but it still felt like a hollow victory. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of what the future might hold. Would she be able to rebuild her life after this ordeal? Would the HOA ever leave her alone, or would they continue to torment her even after she had paid her debt to society? The door suddenly swung open, and the detective re-entered the room, a grim expression on his face. All right, Miss Simmons, let's get this paperwork started. Sarah nodded, steeling herself for the difficult road ahead. She knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to make the most of it. Maybe, just maybe, she could use this experience to find a better way to stand up to the HOA and their oppressive rules. As she signed the plea agreement, Sarah felt a sense of resignation wash over her. But deep down, there was a flicker of hope, a glimmer that perhaps she could turn this setback into an opportunity for something greater. With a deep breath, she looked up at the detective, her expression resolute. "Okay, let's do this." The end.